Bruce was born on November 27, 1940 in San Francisco. His dad was traveling with the Peking Opera. He was a performer. And his wife, Grace, was expecting Bruce at the time.
When Bruce Lee's parents, Lee Hoi Chin and Grace, met each other, it was kind of a relationship that wasn't meant to be in the eyes of the family of Grace Lee. She came from a well-to-do family. They pretty much disowned her because of the fact that she was going with this struggling musician who at the time was a cook's help. Nevertheless, they fell in love and they started a family. And Grace loved Lee Hoi Chin so much that she made the decision if her family didn't want to be in contact with her because of this, then that was okay with her.
The benefit that Bruce had with his American citizenship was that in Asia, it's very traditional. You know, there's certain things you have to follow. You know, it's rigid. Thousands of years of this. You have to do this. You have to do that. And I don't think he followed that mold.
From a very young age, Bruce was very mischievous. He was always into doing practical jokes on his family and friends, and there was more than one occasion that he would get in trouble by his father, Lee Hoi Chin, because he would do certain things that a lot of people didn't think were so funny. For example, he and his sister Phoebe would be hanging outside on the balcony of their home, and there would be people walking on the street below, and Bruce would take things like water, or he would take things like little pebbles and he would drop them from high above from the balcony, and they would hit people, and then he would run and he would hide, and these people would think they're going crazy. They were getting hit with something they didn't know where it was coming from, but these type of things would sometimes get Bruce in trouble when his father found out. Also, when Bruce was about 15, 16 years of age, he would dress up in a traditional Kung Fu uniform, which nobody really did in those days because Hong Kong at that time was kind of this bustling European feel. So everybody was wearing suits and really fashionable attire. But Bruce would decide to wear these Kung Fu uniforms, and he would go down into a crowded area, and people would look at him and point and laugh, and he would wait for somebody he didn't really like or the look of somebody he didn't really like to make fun of him, and Bruce would challenge him and say, "Hey, what are you laughing at? What's so funny with you?" So Bruce was trying to get this other person to start trouble with him so he can practice his martial arts skill. So this is something that he used to do on the weekends and was known for. Many people want to know if Bruce was in a triad gang when he was growing up as a teenager. Well, let's just say that, you know, many of these kids hung out in groups, and when you hang out in groups, sometimes you get labeled as a gang member or something like that. But many of these brothers that he trained with Yip Man were some of the people that were in his club. So yeah, you can call it a gang, you can call it friends, but these are people that he relied on, and his brothers relied on him if there was trouble in the streets. And one of those times was when his brother Robert came home. You know, Robert was very young, and this is, 1957, 58. He was at the local school and watching people playing soccer, and one of the players, an Englishman, kicked the ball and went over to his little brother Robert, and Robert took the ball and kicked it back, and by mistake it went over the fence. And they beat up Robert, and Robert came home all beaten up, and Bruce took his cousin Frank over to the school ground and decided to confront these soccer players. Well, anyway, long story short, Bruce came back that evening with a black eye, blood coming from his nose, and his mother, Grace, was trying to hide Bruce from the father because the father at that point was really getting mad with Bruce all the time for coming home, you know, from fights and being in trouble. So this was just one of the times where Bruce had to test his pugilistic skills against other people.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on.
In his teen years, Bruce Lee was definitely a ladies' man. Many of the local girls thought he was handsome. He knew how to dress well. He knew how to present himself well. And he was just a cool person, an overall cool kid at that time, a teenager. Put into the factor that he was also a great dancer. He won the Cha-Cha Championship of Hong Kong. In fact, that he entered a competition with his brother Robert when Robert was around, I believe, 8 years old. And, they won. So Bruce had a lot going for him. He was cool, he was handsome, he knew how to dress, he had girlfriends. He was just a hip teenager, so he was kind of ahead of the curve at that time.
He's able to apply this dance into his martial arts as far as the rhythms are concerned. Different broken rhythm, the flow, and also it's helped him with his fight choreography, because if you look at what he does, he has a natural rhythm with what he does when he fights on screen. And the correlation here is really interesting because he understands it innately. And what happens is, if you look at Jackie Chan and what John Woo does, Jackie Chan watches Gene Kelly movies. That's where he gets his, and Fred Astaire movies. He gets his inspiration there before he choreographs a fight scene. John Woo watches Seven Brides for Seven Brothers and West Side Story before he choreographs an action scene. So there's a connection there. I mean, these are three of the best action people in the world.
When Bruce was going to school in Hong Kong, he fought a couple of times in boxing. He took up the art of boxing. He loved boxing. Even from a young age, he thought that boxers had this mystery about them and this coolness about them that he really liked. So he thought that he would one day be this boxer. And this is during the same training with Master Ip Man. And so he was involved with a couple of competitions at his school, and he won. He won both of them, and from there got a reputation of this cocky kid that can not only fight well in traditional Chinese martial art, but also boxing, mostly a Western art as well.
The reason Bruce got into the martial arts was because during his youth, he would have run-ins with kids his age. And his parents were concerned that, he had to defend himself. So their parents introduced him to Yip Man, and that's when he studied Wing Chun Kung Fu. He really understood the principles of what Wing Chun was about. It was about simple economy, from point A to point B as fast as possible. If you look at the forms, there's only 3 forms, whereas all the other styles, there's much more. And they were all ornamental. They were very, exotic looking. Visual aesthetics were really nice. But the thing was, Wing Chun, it was very simple and to the point. And I think that appealed to Bruce's personality. Bruce was so addicted to studying that he would sit out in front of Yip Man's school, and he would wait for the other students to come by, and he would just tell them, he's not feeling good today, or he's not here today, so come back tomorrow. And the reason he'd do that was because he would get private lessons with him, so there was no students showing up.
你叫咩名啊？
我叫李小龍，
你咩時間想學拳啊？
見到唔順眼嘅人，我就要打佢。
咁架勢？
Bruce Lee and some of his fellow students would practice these Gung Sao matches on the rooftops of Hong Kong. And they would usually go against other practitioners like Chole foot practitioners. This is where Bruce and many of these other martial artists were able to practice their skill as a martial artist and also refine it.
They would do it in rounds in the rooftops in Hong Kong. And what happened was, Bruce was losing the first round. William Chung and Hawkins Chung were in the corner, and they were telling him what he needed to do. He needed to do this step-up punch where you kind of when you step in, you step up, and the energy comes up from the ground. So the second round, Bruce did it, and he broke the guy's jaw, and that ended the match. And from that point on, he developed the reputation of being a first form person. First form in Wing Chun means your first technique is your strongest. So what Bruce learned in those rooftop matches was that if he was able to get in his first technique, blast right through the opponent with that first technique, he pretty much would win the match because his first technique was so strong. Bruce would train with Yip Man for maybe about 4 years before he came here to the United States. His training wasn't complete. And the thing was when he came here to the United States, he had to figure out different ways to enhance his training. And he would look at other people, see what they're doing. And he would just, that's how he evolved. His kicks, he'd throw more kicks. Whereas in Wing Chun, there's only 2 basic kicks, and nothing went above the hip. And that was the evolution of Junfen Kung Fu.
Most people know Bruce Lee from the films he did in Asia from 70 to 73 that made him an international movie star. But the truth is he was a great childhood actor. In the likes of Macaulay Culkin, he was the biggest childhood star of Asia at that time. He would shoot late at night because it was less noisy at that time in Hong Kong. But the fact remained, Bruce was still a child. And, he would get tired on set. So he would fall asleep, and then when they called him to do his part, he would wake up very professional-like, and he would go do his job, and after he was done, he would go back to sleep. So he was a well-known professional at that time, even for his age. There are many publications that were done back then having interviews with the actors of those films, and they would often praise Bruce as being this childhood actor or teenage actor that had the wisdom and outlook of an adult and knew how to act in front of the camera as well. So he really took this with him to the States.
So in 1959, when he took the boat ride from Hong Kong to the United States, he enrolled in Edison Technical College, and then he eventually transferred over to the University of Washington, and that's where he became a philosophy major.
I was working on a film called The Wrecking Crew with Dean Martin, El Kisoma, Sharon Tate, and myself. And Sharon Tate and I had to there was a fight scene that was required in the film between Sharon Tate and myself. And Bruce was called in to be the choreographer to line up this fight scene and teach us the moves and everything. That's when we first met.
I first met Bruce Lee, I think it was 1968. He was brought to my home by Sterling Silliphant. We were having a dinner party, and I was married to Ted Ashley at the time, and Sterling wanted us to meet Bruce. It turned out that he really wanted Bruce to meet a number of executives who were there at the house with us. And I liked him immensely and immediately as a person. And I was dazzled later when he did some of his demonstrations at Sterling's insistence. But even before that, he was charming and funny and an altogether nice person. I was so glad that Sterling brought him. I was a wildlife photographer before I met Ted Ashley and married him. And I kept taking pictures as a kind of hobby. I would take pictures of our friends when I felt like it. And I liked Bruce and Linda so much that I wanted to take pictures of them, and they let me. And the children, I got to know the children, Brandon and Shannon. And then Bruce asked me if I would photograph him for Black Belt magazine, the cover. Bruce needed to be shot with his chest bare. And he was very proper, and I was very proper. And as an experienced photographer, I knew that he would look best on the magazine if his torso was slathered with baby oil. Well, I was not about to put baby oil on Bruce, so I gave him the bottle of baby oil, and I sort of turned around and fiddled with my cameras. You sometimes have to do something to make the camera record something that is actually more truthful. So, yeah, we did that. Also, he wanted a number of different angles of the shoot for Black Belt, and we did many angles. And he always wanted to be sure that his foot was in the right position, his ankle was in the right position, he was high enough. And I love doing that because I'm a perfectionist too, so we had a great time photographing that cover for Black Belt.
Well, he was always very keen to teach us things, and and my son was very young at that time, and he used to try and get my son to, but Bernie wasn't really into it at that time. He was about 5 or 6 years old. So, but Bruce had a lot of patience, and he was really a dedicated martial artist.
Bruce even taught me to break 2 one-inch boards with my foot. He insisted that I do that because he wanted to be sure that if someone attacked me in a garage, I could kick him and run like hell was the way Bruce put it. He also never taught women to fight with their hands, only with their feet. For one thing, the leg is longer than the arm, but also he didn't think that women should ruin their hands. He had the ability to leap high. I mean, I don't think Baryshnikov or Nureyev could have gone as high in the air as Bruce. He was airborne and would come down in the most perfect positions. And also his movements with his hands. He could do a chop faster than the eye could process it. I mean, still, he had retracted the hand before you actually saw that it had gone out. It was just astonishing. My favorite Bruce Lee shoot, I love them all for different reasons, but maybe if I had to pick one, I would pick the one where I photographed Bruce holding the 1-inch board, and his 5-year-old son, then Brandon, went through it with a kick.
He always wanted us to work out, and I mean, he's always been a martial artist, and he's a martial artist at heart. And at that time, I wasn't really that much into it, and he used to talk me into it, and I said, listen, this is great for you. I know you do ballet, but you should really get into martial arts. And he always persuaded me. He said, start with Tai Chi, which is the foundation for all martial arts. I think if you learn, it's like building a house. That's the foundation. So if you learn Tai Chi, then you can evolve into any kind of martial arts.
He was revolutionary because he did not subscribe to one style. At the time, in the 60s, you trained with one person and that was it. You stayed with that one master and that was it. You hardly ever jumped out and looked what other people were doing. It was style versus style. It was, concept versus concept. Bruce didn't feel that way. He says, I like what they're doing. I'm going to take that. I'm going to take this. I'm going to take that. And he made it into his own belief system.
Bruce did have a great interest in philosophy, and he did have very strong philosophical beliefs. And yes, we talked about them sometimes. I listened to him mainly because he had a very clear view of right and wrong, and a very clear view of how one should behave to honor the fact that we were alive and healthy.
I think because of martial arts and the whole being of being in the martial arts and being aware of Taoism, Buddhism, you cannot help but become philosophical and try to have a better understanding of the world you live in and the environment you're in.
Even at a young age, Bruce Lee was very philosophical. In his early teens, up until he was 19, he would constantly be involved with writing poetry and philosophy as a teenager, sometimes to his girlfriends at the time and other times just for his own benefit. So I always think that he was martially involved, not only in the physical, but also in the philosophical. He always had an interest on a deeper level about humanity and their characteristics.
One of the reasons he was having a tough time at that time in Hollywood was because he would not do anything demeaning. He would not demean his Asian culture. He wouldn't do anything that was insulting to that culture. And because of that, he turned down things that could have made considerable money for him because he had a sense of honor and responsibility. In fact, Tiana Siliphant, Sterling Siliphant's wife, told me that he had urged her when she first came to Hollywood not to do anything in film that was demeaning to her. And she said she turned down things too because she didn't want to admit to Bruce that she had insulted their heritage.
When Bruce first came to Hollywood, he experienced a lot of racism. He was turning down a lot of roles for these stereotypical Asian, what he would call hop-along Wongs, these stereotypical thick-accented, submissive males, and that was not him at all. So he had a hard time, trying to make ends meet and try to make it as an actor. So he started training some Hollywood people that would write stuff for him or get him, certain parts where he didn't have to play the stereotypical roles. For example, the TV series Kung Fu. It was originally his idea. If I remember correctly, it was going to be a movie. But what happened was it ended up going to a Caucasian guy, David Carradine, who did his part.
I think we were having lunch one day, and he comes to me and he says, I am going to do this series, Nancy, called Kung Fu in Hollywood. Sterling wants me to be in it, and I'm just perfect for it. So I said, well, what's it about? He said, oh, it's about this, guy doing Kung Fu, and he goes through he's living in the West, and I'm listening to this, and I'm going, I don't know, Bruce. He said, what do you mean? I said, I don't know if Hollywood's ready for Asian man, Chinese man, to star in a series. Now, you have to remember it was back in the 70s. And he said, no. He said, I bet you. Bruce liked to bet. And I said, okay. We bet, I think it was $10. And unfortunately, he was perfect for the role, but he didn't get the role, and he passed away later on.
After finishing Green Hornet, when he was trying to find work, he'd work on The Wrecking Crew, Blondie, Ironsides, Marlowe. I think he was trying to figure out how he was going to make it here. And the thing was, he was trying to make it here, but not on Hollywood's terms. It was more his terms. How am I going to do it without selling out my race?
I first saw Bruce on the screen in Marlowe with James Garner, and he played an Asian hitman at the time, and he played it with dignity and with a slight smile and without being anything like a cartoon. Bruce had a sincerity in what he did and what he said that I think he would have been a highly regarded actor, quite apart from his skills, had he lived. He was so genuine. I mean, that was the thing about Bruce. I keep coming back to that. The fact that Bruce was only one person. He was not somebody with one kind of person, somebody with executives, somebody with casual friends. He was always Bruce. And that's a compliment I can't give to very many people.
The Big Boss. That was Bruce's first film in Hong Kong. I think it was very important because he started really showing what he could really do. There were some real hokey incidents, in the fight, like the guy with the body as he went through, and some of the trampoline jumps. But this is what I love about him. He made it real for him. When you watched the fight, you really felt for him. You really were behind him because of the way he expressed himself.
I remember I was in Hong Kong when his film they had the first screening. And I remember people telling me about it, that they were so amazed that he lit up the screen and they couldn't believe it. He really got it all together. And I mean, it was just he brought martial arts Kung Fu to a whole new height.
Fist of Fury was probably the most energetic performance out of all his 4 films. I think it showcased the raw energy of him as a film fighter. That was when he started spreading his wings. As far as Way of the Dragon is concerned, this was the first film where he was the producer, writer, director, actor, and choreographer. Way of the Dragon is one of my favorite Bruce Lee movies for several reasons. One, there was humor. There's a subtle humor within the fights, but it was still intense. Each fight was different. When he fought Chuck Norris at the end, there was a strategy. There was a strategy that he had to figure out because he was getting beat in the beginning. Then he found his own rhythm. He started dancing, started moving, the broken rhythm, and that started throwing him off. There's a strategy behind it. And what was really interesting about that fight was at the end, when he killed Chuck Norris, it was like it's no longer a game. When the camera zoomed in on him, you saw that sorrow, that like, oh my God, it was a life-changing decision. I have to kill this guy. Because up to that point, it was all for fun. Every time I watch it, I always learn. He knew all his angles. He knew his edit points on where to cut and where to change the camera. I learned so much from him. I'm indebted to the guy. As far as Game of Death is concerned, I wished he'd have lived so I could have seen exactly what his vision was with that. But what I've seen with all the outtakes was I saw him becoming a true artist. You saw more strategy this time. Each style, each person, each level had a boss. Each guy had a different skill set that you had to adapt and change in order to beat these guys. And that was, I feel, his philosophy in martial arts.
Unfortunately, we had lunch and with Raymond Chow, three of us, and talked about doing a film together, probably a martial arts project because he was doing martial arts. And he said, Nancy, and when he talks, he is full of energy. He said, we got to work together, we got to do something. And the next day, Bruce passed away.
The morning of the day he died, I talked to him on the phone. I had seen Enter the Dragon at a special screening the night before, and we called him to tell him not only how wonderful he was, but what a tremendous star he was, and how proud he was going to be of that movie, and what a huge success it was going to be. And also I was able to tell him about Leo Greenfield's plan to distribute the movie, which was a very unusual plan. He was going to put the movie in some very high-end houses in New York City, which would signal to the public that this movie was a better movie than they might think if they just heard it was about martial arts.
Enter the Dragon was his introduction to the West. The film stock was 1,000 times better than what they had in Hong Kong at the time. The production value. Everything was, turned up 100 times more than his previous films. If you really know your Hong Kong films, you would see Yuen Wah, Sammo Hung, Jackie Chan, Yuen Biao, Lam Ching Ying. You'd see all those guys in there. Enter the Dragon didn't do that well in Asia. And the reason why was because he had nothing to overcome. He was the same person when he started and ended. He got retribution with his sister, death of his sister, and Revenge from Han, but that was it. It was made for Western audiences. If you look at the techniques that he did, they were very simple, much simpler than his other films. It was one-hit knockdowns, which is what was prevalent at the time in the West, and he had nothing to overcome. And watch typical kung fu movies. He had to overcome something. He had to evolve, and in Enter the Dragon, he didn't evolve, and that's why I felt it didn't do well in Asia.
I miss Bruce. I really do. I'm so sorry that he passed away so young, because I think he had a lot to contribute, and who knows? If he had, lived longer, that he might have produced some and been in some wonderful films for us to enjoy. That's the sad part, that we didn't get to see him fulfill himself as a person, as a martial artist, as a philosopher. It's just such a waste.
I think Bruce's gift to the people of Hong Kong and to the people of the world is to find your own truth in life. When you look at what he's done in only 32 years of his life, it can only inspire you. If you look at how he started out as a kid, child actor, getting into trouble, and then he essentially found his own groove. He looked within to find the answers, and his back was against the wall when he came here to America, and he never gave up. And I think it's very important for all of us to follow your dreams. He believed it. You got to believe it, because if you don't believe it, nobody else will. And when you do that, I think you galvanize that philosophy with the universe, and I think that's what he did.